All right, today, for your ethical viewing pleasure, we return to one of the big three of the golden age of Athens. We had Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and we already heard from Plato, bizarrely enough, we used him to introduce egoism. I think in future years I'm going to use Hobbes instead, because Hobbes is more of a modern day egoist, and we just went over him in modern philosophy, and it was just right there in black and white. It's all about self-interest, everything should be geared to that. Where Plato, I think, is more speaking of kind of how things are. I don't know that he's advocating that that's how they ought to be. I think he's just kind of almost like a prophetic fingers, and so would every single one of you if you had those powers or abilities, you would serve yourself, self-interest. So I think it's interesting. But here we have Aristotle, and even though on almost every other issue I would go with Plato, between those two heavy hitters who kind of set the trajectory for Western philosophy even to our own day, we can still see their imprint. I love the idealism more, but Aristotle just knocks ethics out of the park as far as I'm concerned. It's just so good and solid. In fact, he's offering us a whole new venue. All the ones we've done so far have either been teleological, ends-based, consequential ethics, or they've been deontological, intention, duty-based. And Aristotle is offering us what's called virtue ethics. And how virtue ethics differ, it's not that he doesn't care about consequences or intention, but he really believes it all boils down to character. And he believes virtue can actually be habituated. You can actually teach people to be good people. And in fact, this is kind of a Greek presupposition that I've noted as far back as Socrates. I'm sure it goes further. This is also called perfectionism. It doesn't mean perfect like in a Judeo-Christian sense or a biblical sense, but we're talking about like this excellence of character, this high standard that you're striving for. This is not a life of mediocrity. And so, where do I want to start? Knowledge. For the ancient Greeks, especially around this golden period of Athens, we're talking about 4th century BC. For you secular humanists out there, BCE, but okay. So knowledge for the Greeks, at this time period at least, equals good, and ignorance is evil. Aristotle goes so far to actually declare that people only do evil acts out of ignorance. People don't knowingly do evil. How does that resonate with your little evangelical minds and worldview? Although some of you have quite big minds. Most of you actually in here. Okay, all of you.
I understand where he's coming from, definitely. Like, is he maybe I do, maybe I completely don't. Is he coming from the perspective, like, if people only knew, like, the consequences of their action, well, not consequences, see, here I am going into...
That's how I did it this morning too, I'm like, no, it's not a utilitarian thing.
Yeah.
But there's a way to phrase it that captures his meaning without slipping into utilitarianism. So it's not just about the end results or consequences, but it is like you said, if you really knew the full ramifications of what you were about to do, which is kind of another way to say consequences, but I'm not just trying to play word games, but he's not just utilitarian about this.
If you knew the nature of what you were doing, maybe.
Right.
Well, yeah, and because sometimes we break rules because even if we're told that there's something that is good to do, if we don't do it, it's because we don't fully understand why.
Sure.
That if we really understood and appreciated why that was the right thing to do, then we would do it.
Yeah, excellent. That's a really great sorting that out. It's a fun game to play, but we don't have time to play it in here because I would challenge you, just like with egoism, to give me one altruistic act. And so the challenge here would be, show me one, can you give any examples of someone who knowingly did something evil? But see, by definition, you can't. And that makes it non-falsifiable. Just like self-interest, you can't give, or selfishness with egoism, you can't give any counterexample. But that makes everything selfish. And in the same way here, any evil act, by definition, is ignorant. You can't give a counterexample. Because all Aristotle would have to say is, but if they really, really knew, or if they really, really, really knew, they wouldn't have done it. And then it's just like, no. I get his point, and America has largely bought into this model where we believe we can educate people out of poverty, out of drug addiction, out of domestic violence, out of racism, out of
Drug driving.
yeah, whatever. It's we need to educate, and we invest so much money in education. Even in prison reform, this idea of rehabilitation instead of punitive thing. I mean, America's kind of mixed on that, and it goes through cycles. We're, I think, more in a punitive mode right now, but in the 70s especially, it was so focused on rehabilitation. But because we're a utilitarian country and it wasn't working, people were like, well, let's just go back to punishing them again. And then they went the other way, right? 3 strikes, you're incarcerated for life, no hope. But even that became too much, and California just rescinded that. After our prisons are packed to the gills and with all these people, especially if the 3rd strike was something maybe not quite as heinous as the other ones, it's like, oh no, we're really gonna send them to prison the rest of their life because they drove over 100 miles an hour and that's technically a felony? I mean, that's scary. Okay, so that's just good to know because of the presupposition they're coming from. But then, and I might need help if someone wants to Google spell check me, the end goal for Aristotle was happiness. But this is not some sort of yuppie happiness that you got a good job, a 401k, a good health benefit, a beautiful partner, nice house, vacation money, all that kind of stuff. It's not circumstantial happiness. And the Greek word he's using is eudaimonia. And it looks like, yeah, but I believe the pronunciation here is eudaimonia, and I'm welcome for Greek scholars, classical Greek people to correct me if I'm wrong. But the concept here is, this is like a deep-seated, abiding contentment that comes from a well-balanced, a well-proportioned life. So this isn't just this circumstantial happiness, it's almost, and I don't want to over-push it, but it's more like, I think, the Christian concept of joy, where this isn't circumstantial, it's based on the depth of your character and who you are, not your environment and circumstances. And so I think a better translation than just happiness would be like contentment. But we're not talking about, oh, I'm okay. It's not that, it's like a well-structured contentment that comes, he believes it comes by avoiding extremes. And the 2 extremes, Aristotle says you need to avoid are excess and deficiency. Okay. And he believes that by avoiding these 2 things, you will find that well-proportioned, well-balanced life. Once again, you're not just looking for the 2 most extreme views and then finding the middle of the road position. He's not advocating that. But he's saying, through knowledge, try to avoid excesses in your life. They'll put you out of balance, but you also have to make sure there's no deficiencies. That will also make you have an unhappy, unbalanced, uncontent life. And so it reminded me, when I first came across this, I was already aware of the Buddhist teaching of the middle way. And what's freaky is they're writing probably within 100 years of each other, opposite sides of the world, almost identical thoughts. And if you remember the story of Siddhartha Gautama, it was during his ascetic period. There was not a lot of aesthetics to it. But he's like living out with the sadhus, the forest nature priest, you know, just doing the whole full hair shirt immersion project. And one day apparently he's hearing this music instructor teach his student on like a sitar type instrument. And the instructor said, if you tighten the string too tight, it will snap, but if the string is too loose, it will not play. And Siddhartha, who later becomes known as the Buddha, the Enlightenment, has one of those aha moments, and he called it the middle way. You can't be too ascetic, but you don't want to be a libertine either. You need to find that how to navigate between austerity and just a posh style of living. The old timers would call it, you can wreck in either ditch. That doesn't mean drive down the middle of the road, but you don't want to get so close to one edge or the other that you actually go off and wreck your car. So I love it. That's like the easiest way to remember this. This is the don't wreck in either ditch theory. And we'll parse this out in more detail. I'll flip it over and we'll actually look how that works out. But to go with this, so we have knowledge, we have eudaimonia, and then we have erte. And erte can be translated as excellence. And I know this is probably before your time, but this always reminds me of Bill and Ted. It's Excellent Adventure. And their little mantra is, be excellent to one another. And I love this teaching so much. It's actually a quite biblical teaching too, coming from a pagan, pre-Christ Greek philosopher who had some really keen insight on the value of living an excellent life. And what he means by this is, whatever you do towards yourself or others, do in an excellent way. Don't do it enough just to get by or anything like that. And just like I shared with you how my mother explained universals to me through Kant's categorical imperative about the sand dollar story, my father was an Aristotelian. And I actually mentioned this at his memorial service this summer. I just lost him this year. But this was a life lesson he taught me. I must have been 6 or 7 years old, first grade, second grade, somewhere in there. And by day he worked as an administrator. I think he was a principal of the local school. And I'll never forget one night, it was my bedtime, and I noticed my dad was dressed up in like work clothes, not his suit and tie he would wear in the day, but kind of like grungy jeans and stuff. He could get dirty, and he had like a lunch pail or something. And I said, Dad, where are you going? Because I thought it's time to go to bed, and my dad's taken off. And he actually got down on one knee so he could look me in the eye, and he said, I want to tell you something very important, Fred. He said, I'm going to do my second job because I love you and your mother and your family, and I want to provide for you. But he says, in the daytime, I'm the principal, where I hire people, fire people, I set curriculum, I do all these things, I deal with parents. At night, I go to the same school, and I mop floors, scrub toilets, clean out urinals, wash windows. And he says, what I want you to get into your head is whether I'm being the principal or the janitor, I do my very best. I do excellent work. And I don't know why, but that so stuck in my craw, and it has so served me in life. And that's such a biblical principle. When you think about, he who is faithful in little things will be given great things, or the parables of the talents, all those sorts of things. It's doing well, being excellent with what God has given you. That's what you're accountable for. That's what you're being based on, not how you compare to others or those sorts of things. And so this personal level of excellence. Let me just give you one example of how this served me in life. When I was about your age, I couldn't do school anymore. I needed a break to think about all the stuff I'd learned. And so I joined the California Conservation Corps. And the next thing I knew, I'm watering oleanders and picking up trash on the side of the 405 freeway in Megalopolis. And I'm just thinking, good God, what have I done? But because of my upbringing with all these great parents who taught me these profound teachings, I was the best little oleander waterer and trash picker-upper you could find. I was diligent, I had a good attitude, and I took care of business. My peers I was working with, see, our motto in the Conservation Corps was hard work, low pay, miserable conditions. And so a lot of my peers, the vast majority, said, they're paying us minimum wage, we're gonna give minimum effort. But see, my effort was never based on my wage or my salary, it was based on who I was. I was giving them me for that time period. And I would do excellent because I had an excellent view of myself, and my work reflected that. Within 3 months, I had my dream job, dream place. Those people were watering oleanders and picking up trash for the next year of their life while I was in the glorious mountains of California. But see, I didn't do any of that like a utilitarian to get something, or like an egoist. I did it because of who I was. And that's the key here. And it's like the biblical principle of a good tree bears good fruit, a corrupt tree bears corrupt fruit. Thank you. What else do I want to tell you about this? Excellence. Be excellent in all that you do. I know this sounds maybe too trite or colloquial, and this isn't the pagan Aristotle anymore, but this is how my dad kind of Christianized it, or baptized this into a Christian ethic, was and I know this sounds weird, but he says, when I scrub a toilet, I actually imagine that Jesus is going to be the next one to use it. Can you imagine that kind of conception in your work? Or like the next term paper you wrote, or the next editing you did, you were like doing it for Jesus? It like sanctifies all your work. And I'm not trying to collage these series, I'm just showing how enmeshed this was in my own, even though I was brought up in a fundamentalist environment, these virtues were so compatible with my other beliefs and teachings. This one, maybe not so much, right? Because certainly from a Christian perspective, there are people who willfully know and do contrary to their knowledge. And Aristotle can say, well, they didn't really know all he wants, but I think people sometimes really know. Like, there's nothing worse than the evil genius, right?
But they don't know the truth.
Well, sure, that's Aristotle. And since it's non-falsifiable, you could argue it forever. And, which is fun, I just don't have time to do it.
But even biblically speaking, like these evil people, like there's no truth in them.
Oh, right, they don't understand,
Yeah,
really.
exactly.
So Aristotle is correct.
Yeah.
It's just, it doesn't really mean anything, is the point I'm making. When you make a non-falsifiable statement, there's no way to counter it, so it's really not giving you any valuable information, is the problem. Okay. Anything else I need to tell you about that before we parse it out? I think that's good. Just remember, this isn't circumstantial, this is deep-seated contentment, well-being, and I don't even want to say balanced, because that implies more like you're on a fence, right? You know, straddling that white line or the yellow line down the middle of the highway. So it's not about that, it's well-proportioned, I think, is a better description. Everything is in
moderation.
Yeah, all things in moderation.
I said excellence in moderation.
Yes. Which is a delicious paradox, because then you even have to do moderation and moderation. And the only way to do moderation is to occasionally insert a wee bit of excess or deficiency. Right? Otherwise you're being overly, excessively moderate. But if you're never moderate, you're being deficiently moderate. Are you guys familiar with the golden mean?
A little bit.
Somewhat.
More than less.
It's where we get the mathematical formula, I think it's phi. If someone wants to look out the exact numerical value of that, that would be fascinating to me. It's like 1.168, something like that.
1.6180339.
Yeah, it just keeps going. And well, it should. And this is basically later I think in the 12th century, 13th century, if someone wants to check a data for that, Fibonacci, the mathematician Fibonacci, was able to run with this, but we really weren't able to see the full manifestation of what this looks like until the modern computer age, where we could generate this, massive amounts in higher or smaller. Because it's where we get fractal, like the fractal mathematics from. Anyways, the Greeks learned early on that asymmetry is more dynamic and aesthetically pleasing than symmetry. Because a purely symmetrical world is static. It's not moving. It's like this balanced proportion. It's like the difference between a world made up of geometrical shapes like rectangles and triangles, right? Could you imagine? It's like those cartoony like Minecraft games, right? Where everything's just these pixelated geometric shapes, but that's really not how the world looks. The world is really more of a fractal model where you see these repeating patterns, but then with deviations on the theme. And you see these are each divided into thirds, but it's like Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, how he shows the proportions of the human body are broken up into the same sort of Fibonacci sequence. And so what the Greeks learned, that if you, not going down the middle, but you divide this rectangle into thirds, and then into thirds again, and 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 again, this is the pattern we see throughout nature in things like nautilus shells, pine cones, the human fingerprint. Some people have called it the thumbprint of God. And you might be saying, that's really cool, Blackburn, but this isn't philosophy of art. Why are you even talking about it? Because when we're talking about eudaimonia, it's not finding that balance point between two extremes. It's finding that well-proportioned place for your life. And this is just an example how here it's in a third, but for other people it might be in different places or different ways. Okay, so if we go back to this idea of, on the one end we have excess, and over here we have deficiency. So he's kind of seeing ethics almost like the spectrum that you can move on. And you can use this as an individual. And remember, when Aristotle's writing, it's the polis, the city-state. So people identified as, I am Athenian, I am Corinthian, I am Spartan, but then, remember, in his time period, Philip of Macedon is uniting all these city-states into a nation-state, into an empire. And so that's very interesting. But this can work on an individual level or an imperial level, okay, which is awesome. So Aristotle's classic example is the quality of fear. So what would we call someone who has an excess amount of fear?
Timid? A coward?
Timid, coward, exactly. And someone who has a deficiency of fear.
Courageous, fearless, bold.
Stupid. Too much.
Crazy.
Stupid,
Reckless.
foolhardy, reckless.
Oh.
Courage is actually the golden mean. And why would that be, Sophie?
Because it's not a deficiency of like fear. It's not that it doesn't exist, but it cannot be cowardice.
Exactly. The courageous person knows there's good reason to be afraid. They're aware, knowledgeable of the situation. They act in spite of their fear. These people act in ignorance of their fear. These people are overwhelmed and incapacitated by their fear. But like I said, we're not just looking for the middle ground between these two extremes. For different people, like the person born super timid, they might be afraid of their own shadow, a real meek, frail constitution. For that person, this might be the golden mean for them. Their city's being invaded, and they've been called out to defend the city, and they actually take a chain and a stake and they chain themselves to the battlefield so they cannot run away, even if they wanted to. They might pass out, they may wet themselves, but they're there. That might be a golden mean for that kind of person. But if you're Achilles, who the gods have dipped in invincibility by his tendon, for Achilles, a well-proportioned life might be, because he has no reason to fear, except a wise, knowledgeable Achilles would wear maybe a little buckler over his tendon, right? That would be a well-proportioned response for Achilles, or for this person, just showing up is saying huge things. Most of society is going to be somewhere in here, okay? But see, that's what I love. It allows for the individual piece, but then you can have a collective median for your city or your school or your household or your state. So let's do some real live, I did abortion in last class. It was kind of unpleasant.
Like excessive abortion, deficiency of abortion.
Well, let's do it just because it is there, and it really does show how our society actually uses this, maybe on an unconscious level, but, and there's a lot of social theory like that the point of society is to bring equilibrium of the people. And when things get out of balance, corrections are made. You see this all the time in our country, between the left and the right, the progressives and the conservatives, trying to keep each other from pulling the country into what they see as excess or deficiency from their point of view. And having them together, I don't know, it could be part of the brilliance, but also the frustration of our type of government. It can be so frustrating to see just the stalemates and deadlocks and nothing happening. The bright side is there's stalemates, deadlocks, and nothing's happening. Because if one or the other side got their way, good Lord, where would we be, right? I don't care if you're progressive or conservative. If they're unchecked, where they could take you probably isn't where the general population wants to go. Yeah, the fringe people are all about it.
Yeah, because we could do the same scale with either progressiveness or conservativeness.
Yes, you could. Or we could line them all up together. You could do this theologically. You could do this with human sexuality. You could do this with anything. So just because we're here, we'll do abortion. But I'm so tired of talking about it. What would an excess abortion look like?
Okay, so hold on. Before we start,
Okay.
oh gosh, are we doing? Is this from Aristotle's his theory? Because I could easily see an excess deficiency through like utilitarianism for like results based.
No, this is just he's trying to find that balance between extreme positions. But it's not motivated by utilitarianism, it's motivated by trying to get to this place of a well-proportioned life, or in this case, society.
Yes,
So a woman or man could do this on the individual level, but a nation could also do this to determine what's legal and what's not.
Because I can see from the utilitarian perspective, excess being annihilation and deficiency being like, say, no population control and overpopulation, but that's very results oriented, so I'm not sure how
Right.
to.
That's not where his head's at. His is, how do we have a balanced, well-proportioned society? But you could do this at the family level, you could do this at the individual woman's level.
Okay.
And yes, ultimately, if you were to do this correctly, that would end up with the ideal result. But he's not just looking at the results to motivate his actions.
Right.
Okay.
Right, because this is character-based, not utility-driven, or not even duty-driven. So interesting. This is a different view altogether than teleological or deontological theories.
Because you can have an excess of utilitarianism and a deficiency of
You
utilitarianism.
could.
Well, then
So
what
weird.
would be the ideal thing according to Aristotle? I guess is the question.
Depends
A
on who you're
well-proportioned position, which is avoiding these two
asking.
extremes.
Again, knowledge, aware of both perspectives, and trying to figure out like the best way to reconcile them.
Yeah. And that will bring the most happiness.
It still
But
seems
it's
very
not-
results oriented is my problem.
There are results here, but that's not
It's not the point, not the intention. The intention is not results.
right.
Yes.
Although he does care about results, he believes we're meant. But I kind of skipped a step here, which maybe will help answer the question.
Okay.
And yes. Aristotle, I knew I brought this up for a reason.
Yes.
I don't know if we talked about this before, but Aristotle makes a distinction between actuality and potentiality. For example, if we take like an acorn has the potentiality to become an oak tree. And I would love to draw this all day, but that's enough to make the point, okay? An acorn is not an oak tree, but it has the potential to become an oak tree. An infant, or if you want to get into that, a fetus is not a human, but it has the potential to become a fully mature, reproductive, possible human being. That would be the end goal of a boy to a man, where a man could sire his own children, same acorn to oak tree, a tree that now produces its own acorns. Okay, it is fully actualized now, it has fulfilled its potentiality. He also talks about different causes. Is this showing up in the screen?
A little bit.
If not, you can even pivot it a little.
Oh no, it's
Okay.
captured as small.
Aristotle talks about 4 different causes. The first would be the material cause. So this is a piece of marble. The physical material cause is the marble. The efficient cause is the sculptor who's bringing this image out of the stone. The formal cause is I'm making a image of this god or this hero. And the final cause is to set it in a place of honor or worship or remembrance in a temple or a mausoleum or something like that. So I just love the way his head's working here. So he sees things in these different qualities of material, efficient, formal, or final. But all of us have those things, even as humans, where we move through from the potentiality of the material to the actuality of the final cause.
So what would our efficient cause be?
Probably in this case, our society, parents, educators, philosophers, religious leaders, kind of like helping shape you into the citizen people who are teaching you how to have character, have virtue. And you could parse that out for how that would work for making a citizen of the city-state. From this raw material of humanity through training, education, to you become this fully mature member of the society. And the final cause is, you are what is passing on that legacy, the laws, the customs, your seed into the next generation. It's fascinating. Okay. Did that help?
It might have. I might have an idea where this is going.
So
Does it depend?
So
on
that's
the-
where I think we're getting away from the utility to where he wants to see
What kind of
people
person are you
fully
becoming?
actualized, not in one of these potential states, but I think the fully virtuous person is going to be an actualized person.
And what if the fetus does not have the potential to become that fully actualized?
It does have the
Thing.
potential.
Well, say with genetic problems or
Oh.
whatever. That's the first thing that came to mind when you brought this up. So I
Okay,
guess I was
well,
on this right
then let's
track.
do this and you'll see.
Okay.
Actually, we can even do this how America is right now because we basically defaulted into Aristotle's golden mean on this topic. From my perspective, I'm sure the far left and far right would totally disagree with me, but that's the nature of this, right? If you're on the fringes, the people in the middle are gonna seem like the opposing party, right? These people are just wackadoodles, right? And I don't know if you've noticed that politically. So you've got the vast majority of Americans are, probably somewhere in here. And so generally, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll do politics next. Let's stick to this one before I get totally. What would an excessive abortion look like? Yeah, you have a ZPG, zero population growth society. It becomes criminal to produce children. No, all fetuses, all is aborted. Okay, so all, and then obviously a deficiency, none. Doesn't matter. Life of the mother, birth defects, rape, incest, you're not doing it. We simply do not do that in our society. And if it means the mother and child are gonna die, it's worth it to keep from going into. But see, this is what Aristotle's saying. No, if you take either of these positions, you're in crazy town, you're not going to be in balance, you need to move it. So, people at Planned Parenthood would probably say, okay, well, yeah, that's a little crazy. So the next, I think, most extreme view would be using abortion as a means of birth control. And I've known lots of people who've worked for Planned Parenthood and other things, and they would never say that that's what it's for. It's like, it's supposed to be like a last resort. They want to provide for you with things to keep you from getting pregnant or STDs or things like that. They're not just an on-demand, oh, let us abort your baby. At least the people I've talked to, that's not where their heads or hearts were. And so people who are thinking of it in that way, that's still really extreme. Okay? So over on this side, you'll have often even very conservative Catholics or evangelicals who will say, you know what, we really hate the idea of abortion, but you know what, if the mother is gonna die, that's a mitigating circumstance. Especially if they're both gonna die. If you could save the mother through terminating the pregnancy, yeah, it's not ideal, but it would be crazy to make them both die for some ideal, right? When our school was over at the other campus, I'm trying not to drop names here, they were actually being protested by a group who had this view. No abortion for any reason. And because that particular church held life of the mother was acceptable, they were being protested by this other group. And they were shocked because they thought they were as far conservative as you could get. And then they found someone who saw them as child killers, basically. And I thought it was hilarious, just because the perspective shift, for people that weren't aware, they weren't maybe as far as they thought they were. But then you could keep moving, right? Some people say, okay, life of the mother, but yeah, what about incest? Because if you know about genetics and incest, if you've ever met a child of incest, it's usually quite tragic. There's usually birth defects, almost always some sort of mental loss of ability. And then think about the emotional and social trauma of finding out your grandfather is your father or something like that, and just think of what that would do to you as a young person. And others would say, yeah, or what about like rape? Why would we make a woman carry the child of the person who did that to her? That's just cruel and inhumane. And others would say, maybe in the cases like extreme deformity, where they're just going to live a vegetative state, or they're just going to be a burden on society, that there won't be anything but a drain on resources, emotions, all of that. And you could keep working this way as well. And over here, maybe it's kind of like, the really extreme would be like partial birth abortions, although apparently we are moving even further than that in the recent weeks, where I was just seeing the legislation about actually trying to make sure there was legal protections against infanticide, and that was not passed. And I need to look at it. It's real recent, and I got to look at the legislation. But so this would be like up to or even after birth, like say an abortion was unsuccessful, the doctor's not required like they were in the past to do all they could to save that botched abortion. But you see the problems there already, right? The intention was to terminate that, and now it could be mutilated, it could be all kinds of horrible things, and now you're going to save it. But later in the class, I have some great videos if you want to explore this topic more. I don't necessarily, but if you want to, I'm here for you. And we kind of, in our culture, we see from the last trimester, last 3 months, to the mid, 3 to 6, and then all the way to 3 months. It's kind of like the longer you have gestated, the more rights you kind of gain in our society. Where until recently, apparently, you had full rights as a US citizen and a human being at birth. That was, for whatever reason, our society decided that was the line of where you got full rights. But until then, you had partial rights. But this is part of the schizophrenia of our legal system. A woman could literally be on her way to an abortion clinic, hit to have an abortion. She could be hit by a drunk driver, and that drunk driver could be charged with a double homicide for the woman and that fetus. But she could, without civil penalty, terminate that of her own volition. And that's kind of like the intention piece of our laws. And don't get me wrong, I think it's super important, that intentionality piece. But you see the weird, it's like, wait, how can we, but that's a problem in our pluralistic society with these very opposing views of the values. And it's usually pitted something about life of the unborn versus the free choice of a woman, right? Is usually how you see it pitted. I mean, everyone calls the opponents the heinous thing, right? Like, you're pro-abortion, or pro-abortionists don't, or pro-women choice is how they would self-identify. And then they would talk about the others as anti-woman, not pro-life, right? And so that's a problem. When you vilify the opposition, you're not even listening to the other side anymore. You're in this. So our society has kind of rested in this mid-range ground on this topic. And like I said, as it gets, when it's closer to three months, there's not so much, you could probably go in without a lot of fuss and have them taken care of. If it's between 3 and 6, they're gonna ask, well, why are you waiting? Or you have second thoughts, maybe you should talk to a counselor. If you're waiting to the last trimester, there probably needs to be a serious medical condition, at least there needed to be in the past, that could be changing. And so that's what I mean, you see this graduated scale. Now, any individual woman could do this for themselves, but as a society, we've kind of nestled in this kind of mid-range. Is that so interesting? And I don't even think that's conscious, I just think that's Aristotle's golden mean in action in a very practical way. But you could do that politically, you could do that with religion, etc., etc. I see fidgeting, are we out of time?
We are.
Like 10
Can
minutes
we
ago.
just critique it real fast? It's pretty simple to see the potential. You can see the value.
Mhm.
In fact, I wish more Christians would apply this to their life. Like, what about an excess of religiosity, right? Or we could say spirituality, but I don't mean true spirituality. I mean that every time you see someone, it's like, could we pray, brother? Or, praise Jesus. What do you think about this guy? It's like, okay, that's really neat, but really? Or then the deficiency would be no interest in the things of God or spiritual matters, or it's just like downtime for you. And you can see in a community like ours, we see both, right? People with no mind for spiritual things and people that it's just like, just give it a break. Watch a B-grade movie every once in a while. You need to chill out. You're going to hurt yourself and others. Even Ecclesiastes tells us, be not righteous over much, or be not overly wicked. Why should God destroy you before your time? And I'm not talking about true righteousness, which I believe is found in Christ, but I'm talking about that anal, retentive, narrow, the traffic's moving at 70, but the speed says 65, and you're going 65, even if it means you jam up and cause an accident, because you're not going over 65. And I'm not saying that as an excuse to rationalize or break the laws, but when you have this slavish devotion to the the law, you can actually hurt yourself and others. Okay, I'm sorry, quick critique, I'm sorry. Thanks for your patience.
Critique. I
Pros
bet you
or
not
cons?
everyone would, well, it doesn't matter what everyone would think the golden mean would be, first of all, but not
It's
everyone would
different for
agree
everyone.
anyways. And that might be, again, it's kind of like almost like Kant, like Aristotle's enlightened, and he'd probably disagree with what society thought the golden mean was, but we don't have Aristotle
Doesn't
anymore.
society determine the golden mean though?
For society.
Exactly.
Just like for this class, we kind of golden meaned out our trip. I had this like grand week-long 9-day journey into the wilderness, and other people were just like, could we do a day trip, right? And so we tried to negotiate to find a mean. More of you were towards the day trip end of the spectrum than the let's do some, extravaganza. And we worked together to come up with something that provides equilibrium within our group. It's beautiful. Like I said, you can reckon either ditch is a great way to remember this. I love that saying, but I love the paradox of moderate in all things, including moderation. But see, because this is also a reason-based theory, it's susceptible to rationalization. I could rationalize virtually anything as long as I'm moderate about it. Rape, torture, murder.
Don't
I
like
could
everyone.
I could find a way to show you that was well balanced in the scope of overall things. And that concerns me. I mean, he used this as a misogynist, a slaveholder of an elite social caste, all that, was easily justifiable by this system. As long as you didn't enslave everyone, as long as you didn't rape everyone, as long as you didn't kill everyone, you could come up with, but you certainly could kill the people with birth defects or criminal minds or slovenly behavior. That's not excessive, that's just having a well-balanced society. Okay. All right, I just love this, and I think, once again, this was kind of what I was talking about at the group homes with the line staff. Did I mention that last class? Ethics of Care, the group home I worked in. And the male line staff were super authoritarian, and the females were this earth mother loving type.
Mhm.
I actually used this, even before I knew what it was, to try to find that balance between the two. And how I would do it, and it's the same technique I use as a professor or at home with my children, because it's a dynamic relationship. It's always in a state of flux. So in the group home, when the young men would no longer relate to me or share with me, I realized I had become too authoritarian. And so now they were responding to me in that way. And so I would try to become more personable, less rigid, less tight. But if I asked them to do their chore, and they're like, who are you talking to, bro? You empty the dishwasher. I'd realize I had become too empathetic, too relational, where I had lost my authority. And so I would have to tighten it up a little bit. Same in the classroom. If you're such an authoritarian, dogmatic teacher, you have no relation with your students, how tragic is that? But if you have no boundaries, no guidelines, people aren't going to show up, they're not going to turn in their work, they're not going to do their reading, they'll be talking amongst themselves when the people that do want to learn are there. And so trying to navigate that balance between that authoritarian and then just being somebody's buddy. And with the parent, it's that same way, trying to find that happy medium, that golden ground where people can flourish and come into their actuality from their potentiality. All right, thank you guys. That was